Our first speaker this afternoon is Professor Stephen Blackmore, who is the Regius Keeper and the Queen's Botanist of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. He really needs no introduction because he has been a leader in the botanic garden and botanical world and plant conservation world for many years. He's been Regius Keeper at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh since 1999, and before that was Keeper of Botany at the Natural History Museum in London. The title of his presentation is on Partnerships for Plant Conservation. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an extremely great pleasure to be here, and I have to say that I enjoyed the opening procedures of the conference this morning as much as any I've ever been to. I thought that was really wonderful, and it strikes me that as somebody who's visiting New Zealand for the very first time and been here just a couple of days, that to understand the extent to which in the cultural importance and significance of biodiversity is understood in this country in a really deep and profound way, which was just wonderful. So the title of my talk then is Partnerships for Plant Conservation, but it could equally well have been Partnerships for Planet Conservation, because plant life is not an optional extra that we might decide that we want to conserve, but it is in fact essential for the healthy functioning of our planet and for our own continued survival. And given that the global ecosystem, the biosphere of planet Earth, depends on harvesting the energy of the sun through photosynthesis, there really couldn't be anything more important to deal with than the topic of conserving plants. And the whole point of my talk today is to suggest that for our own sake and for our own futures, we must focus on preserving a photosynthetic planet that functions in the ways that we need it to, but that we can only do that through our partnerships. It's too big a task for any botanic garden, and even for small coalitions of botanic gardens. It needs massive partnership. And nature is unfortunately on the retreat in most places around the world, so we need to focus on what we can do together out of what some people have called enlightened self-interest. My graphics are slightly crude and definitely not to scale, but that really is a simple explanation of how the planet works. I'll come on to a much more elegant chart, one which was drawn by Earl Ellis from a paper of his in 2011, slightly redrawn it, but it shows us the extent to which the ice-free land surfaces of our planet have been transformed by human activities through time. So it shows that about half of the world's wild lands have disappeared since 6000 BC, and 6000 BC is the point at the left of the graph running up to 2000. And most of that transformation of the planet happened within the last 300 years or so. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. And densely settled areas, cities and urban areas in red here, have been increasing steadily, but there's been an even more significant increase in the range lands and the grazing lands for animals. I've slightly projected this on into the future in a very simplistic way to show what might happen in the next 50 years, which is extremely optimistic. I mean, for example, if I merely continued those curves, we see that the disappearance of wildland is continuing, but maybe not rapidly. And I suspect that that would be a great underestimate of the future we actually face. But we know that these trends that have been going on in the last 300 years are going to continue, and that's what we have to come to terms with. And on this version, I've simply superimposed in a rather crude way, not a very precise graph of the growth in human population through the same time, but nevertheless, that's what the curve represents, showing that we humans passed 1 billion in about 1800, 2 billion people by 1930, more than 7 billion of us today, and heading towards perhaps 9.5 or 10 billion by the mid to end of the present century. Those projections, of course, are looking at the future not certain, but that's the direction of travel at present. And this, to me, if you put the charts together of transformation of the biosphere together with human population, for me is a summary of all of the greatest challenges that face mankind. And I think what we need to focus on as a species is the balance between these different kinds of photosynthetic system. So I wouldn't argue that we don't need food production, of course we do, but it's the balance between photosynthesis converted into food through agriculture versus photosynthesis providing ecosystem services and a healthy environment. And I actually don't think we currently know precisely what we need that balance to be, but the rate of change is not going in a favorable direction. So it's against that background then, a world changing more rapidly than ever before, that fortunately we have got a global strategy for plant conservation, and it's been touched on this morning. So I hope I won't repeat the points that Sarah made about it. But what I would say about the strategy is that it proceeds from targets for the knowledge base. It starts out with a set of targets which are the information we need to have for conserving plants. And it moves on through its targets then towards a focus on action and wider engagement. Not sure what's happened here. But the wider outreach into society. That's the kind of direction of travel through the targets of the convention, of the strategy. And I'll remind us too, sorry, why did that happen? It's gone. That the CBD itself focuses on 3 levels, on an ecosystem level, species level and genetic diversity level. And I want to say a little bit in my talk about those 3 different levels of thinking, because I think they're also important to the challenges that lie ahead of us. If I start by talking a little bit about ecosystems, our knowledge at the ecosystem level then, that higher level of the CBD, has developed quite rapidly in recent years, and in particular the emphasis on important plant areas through the GSPC has been extremely welcome and really very good. But I wanted just to mention a newer initiative, the idea of having red lists for ecosystems that personally I've only become aware of relatively recently, so I thought I'd share it with you. And so from a paper by David Keith and collaborators published earlier in the year, there's an idea of using the kind of analysis of threat and status that we apply in species red listing to ecosystems. And I think there's a lot of merit in an approach like that to actually formally recognize what is different at the ecosystem level from one place to another and how we might use that to define conservation strategies. So it's an important aspect then of the knowledge base, although knowledge alone does not make conservation happen. But that, I think, is a really interesting and recent approach. I find it important because that deals neatly with the ecosystem level, and I'm going to come on to the species level in a moment. But my big question, and I haven't anything to show you, is how do we cope with genetic diversity, which I think we're beginning to, but not yet doing very well. So red listing is a much more familiar approach, of course, and something which is progressing very well. Target 2 of the global strategy calls for an assessment of conservation status of all known plants. And through red listing, we're inching our way towards getting that knowledge base that we need. There's a European red list. I recently saw that there's one for China. And to have that complete analysis of one of the richest floras in the world, the more than 30,000 species in China, is really a great achievement. Wonderful, in fact. And I've been particularly pleased that BGCI has taken an approach to red listing which is a slightly different one. Traditionally, red lists focus on geographical areas, but I like the focus on groups, oaks, maples, magnoliaceae, rhododendrons, because I think that is a way of pulling in the expertise of specialists who know about those families and those groups and drawing that together. But what I wanted to draw out at this point is just look at the range of logos involved in producing even any one of these reports. And in speaking about partnership, that is absolutely the way we have to work. Organizations like Species Survival Commission, Flora and Fauna International, IUCN, and others have been active participants in these red lists, together with people from the Botanic Garden community. And I think that's the way to do it. I just wanted to show you, so partnerships of experts, but also of organizations. I wanted to show you one lovely example that I saw recently when I was visiting the Kunming Institute of Botany and looking in their botanic garden, which reminded me of how important our living collections are. That this specimen of Magnolia sinica, which has got a scaffolding up it because it had flowered for the first time in 30 years in cultivation, and now from that and from seed set, a beautiful collection of young Magnolia sinicas, a critically endangered species, has been developed in the Botanic Garden. And actually, we were discussing when I visited and with Sun Wei Bang, who's here in the audience and who will tell you more about this later in the conference, I think, that part of their project is very much looking at the genetic diversity of those seedlings that they've got and at the trees that they're growing. And I think that's just hugely important. So we are beginning to try to engage at the genetic level. A few quick examples from the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. I think it's natural that botanic gardens focus on the native plants of their region, and we've certainly been doing that through Target 8 project in Edinburgh, which my colleague David Ray, who's here, established. And the UK in total has 345 threatened species of vascular plants, and 155 of those grow in Scotland. And we have 116%, in other words, 70% of Scotland's threatened plants in cultivation now, and a growing number of those actually involved in restoration projects. But again, what I really want to tell you about that is, although I say we, it's a partnership project. We're working with Scottish Natural Heritage, who are the country conservation agency. We're also focused on a few other groups of plants, not necessarily growing in Scotland, and conifer conservation has been important for us for a long time. Significant proportion, 48% perhaps, of conifers are threatened in the wild. And the International Conifer Conservation Project has taken a really unique approach to partnership in that it distributes plants not just to other botanic gardens, but to private landowners who are committed to conserving and protecting those populations. And I think we've heard already today that our partnerships need to include people in wider society, not just the professional organizations. But on the right here, on the left, natural populations of monkey puzzle trees in Chile. On the right, this is Benmore Botanic Garden, where a young population of monkey puzzle trees, sampling the genetic diversity, is now growing up. So we have made efforts to capture that genetic diversity, which in a world of changing climate is of huge importance in order to capture the genetic diversity we'll need for adaptation and mitigation. I mentioned that more and more plants are involved in species recovery programs. It's important, of course, that the genetic material is right. And I would say that we're very pleased as an institution with what we're achieving, but at the same time, we're very aware that it is a tiny contribution to be making. It's just a drop in the ocean, really, compared with the scale of challenges to plants in situations in countries around the world. So important though these projects are, and valuable though they are, there is so much more we need to do. Sarah mentioned this morning the importance of the Ecological Restoration Alliance, because our species recovery projects are small, and we as a community of botanic gardens do need to scale up our efforts and get into ecological scale of restoration. And that is, of course, the purpose of the Ecological Restoration Alliance, which was founded pretty recently, really, in 2012. That was a group of the Botanic Garden directors who were the initial signatories. And it's, I think, gaining momentum with funding for some projects already in place. But even if every botanic garden in the world and all of us in the room were active partners, it still wouldn't have what it needed in order to bring about the level of partnership and interaction that we need. And critically, I think we need to work with other agencies and organizations. I'm thinking of protected area managers through national parks and other protected areas, private landowners, as I've mentioned in the Conifer Conservation Project, and increasingly large areas of the world are in private ownership with conservation as a stated aim. Forestry organizations, agricultural organizations, and which for me is why it's great that our large Chinese delegation includes formal representation from state-level forestry, because botanic gardens alone can't do what is necessary. We need to work together in those types of partnerships. We also need to think about the cities. We know that we're living in a planet where half of us are now city dwellers, and actually the migration into cities is continuing. So one of the big issues I think for the future will be the relationship between cities and the biodiversity that supports and sustains them. Are we actually going to be able to have sustainable mega cities in which the environmental services continue to work? And I've been really interested through the CBD to see the recent focus now on cities and biodiversity. And for me, that's an area where the partners would include not just city and governments and organisation, but the botanic gardens. And many of us run botanic gardens that are in a city, and we have the right starting place for doing that. So we might not traditionally have thought that the city was our partner, but I think for the future, increasingly, it will be. You won't be able to read these images, but all of these are articles from a single issue of Nature magazine, which was published on the 18th of April this year. And it struck me as I was leafing through that issue of Nature that on almost every page, I found some reason or another why the planet needs to invest more in its studies of plants and to scale up what we might do. Articles about the effect of drought on agricultural profit, on the use of satellites to monitor deforestation, new discoveries about how the terrestrial water cycle actually works and the importance of transpiration in plants, which we haven't fully understood until some new results coming out just this year. Often amazes me how little we know about this planet. The role of nitrogen deposition from the atmosphere, looking at the ability of forests to store carbon. A whole series of articles then about how the planet really works in much more detail than I had in my crude graphic at the beginning. What I think we as a community need to do is to say that when you see new science findings like this that show that this planet basically only works because it has plants on it, is to show that botanic gardens are amongst the lead partners you want in the projects for the future. We're not the sole partners, but we need to be there. And I think if there is going to be a growing understanding and awareness at a political level, which we already see in countries, and again, I'll mention China, Korea, I was recently in Singapore, 3 examples where at a government level, the connections between botanic gardens and sustainability are firmly understood. And that is what we need to work to do, I think, because only through that will we be able to get the right kind of partnerships for botanic gardens to succeed. So what are the obstacles? What's stopping us? I thought I'd say a little bit about that. Well, we are, first of all, lacking in resources of sufficient people, sufficient money, and a big enough skill base. But actually, we have a great set of resources already. Just look at the participation in this meeting. So we have a firm platform for starting from. We're certainly well informed. We know what we need to do, but it's not adequately resourced yet. And I think, for me, that's our biggest obstacle. We have an excellent toolkit for dealing with plant conservation through the Plants 2020 website and all that that contains. So we have knowledge, we've got a basis of what to do. The second major obstacle, I think, is that challenge of scaling up our projects, going from the species action level that we're fairly familiar with in most of our gardens, taking that up towards the ecological level, but also drilling down to the genetic level, which involves changes and challenges too. So scaling up in those 2 different directions. I think traditionally in gardens, when we've thought about genetic diversity, we've been very cautious and conservative, probably rightly so. Why would we accidentally mix up genetic material? But at the same time, in the world today, if I think of reforestation efforts in the United States, for example, it's increasingly the case that successful tree stock has to come not just from native species, but with genetic material that's been introduced in a managed and deliberate way to provide resistance to pests and diseases. And I have a strong feeling that the future is going to look more and more like that. So again, one of the fine balancing acts for us is going to be between our natural instincts to focus so entirely on the provenance of material and the right genetic starting material. But in reality, we may be obliged also to look at very skillful selective development of particularly tree species that frame ecosystems. That may be a challenge for us then, but where better to do that than in botanic gardens and to find out how to do it? I think we are the natural starting point for such research. The third challenge, as I'm going to set out, I would describe as within our own community. We really are great at working together as botanic gardens, and as has been mentioned by Peter, I was at the Natural History Museum in London for 20 years. I thought museums were pretty well networked, but they're way behind the botanic garden world, which is much better joined up. But nevertheless, we do sometimes, by accident I think, more than design, end up doing things which tend to compete internally with us. And I would have to say that personally I'm rather concerned that the recent attempts and efforts to revitalise the International Association for Botanic Gardens, IABG, which was once upon a time a very active network but has been dormant effectively for several decades. And that worries me because we now have perhaps several competing organisations leading botanic gardens. And you might know, many of you, that in actual fact I'm on the newly formed council of the IABG. So what am I doing with a foot in two camps there and also very much committed to BGCI? Well, I've got my foot in both camps because I want to try to help bring about the coming together of those organisations. There was an intention many, many years ago that the two would merge. We only need one organisation for botanic gardens. And I think that we will get to that point of merger in the not too distant future in a way and a shape and form which allows botanic gardens to speak with a single voice. And personally, I think that's an extremely important thing. We have to be careful not to create an impression of internal competition or an interaction which detracts from our focus and our attention. So I put this leaf here. The message of this image is basically, let there be light. Let us understand, and with that light shining, see that in fact in botanic gardens we have only one set of people and one set of botanic gardens, and we're all the same people, and we need one organisation to come out of the two that we have and to represent us in a merger, and I think that has to be the way forward. So I'm just going to draw a few conclusions now. I hope that I've reminded us that every botanic garden can develop plant conservation projects. I'm thinking of working with the nationally and locally threatened species. That's a firm foundation, but also engaging with wider society is something that every botanic garden can, and most, in fact, do engage in very actively. Secondly, I've tried to make the point that plant conservation really can only be delivered through a partnership approach, not just between botanic gardens working together, but with many other agencies, especially those responsible for managing land, forest and water resources. And that, I think, will also be the route through to new sources of funding of the scale that we actually need. And finally, I think that the challenge of plant or planet conservation requires a massive partnership through botanic gardens, and I'm very pleased that we have BGCI bringing us together through these series of global congresses, and that is the sort of platform that we need. So I'd like to end by congratulating BGCI for its achievements to date, and the staff have done brilliantly well and achieved a lot over the years. Joan Walmsley mentioned this morning that shortly I will take over from her, which I must say is a very daunting challenge and one that I approach with considerable humility. But my commitment to BGCI is extremely strong, and I believe that botanic gardens can and will change the world in the positive ways we need for the future. So congratulations to Dunedin Botanic Garden on 150 years. I don't doubt that what you do in the next 150 will be even more important, and thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
There are time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone would like to pose some to our speaker. Stunned them into silence.
Yes.
Yes, please. Stephen, you mentioned that...
Scott, just give your name and affiliation.
Certainly, Scott Memory, Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And so, a question from Professor Blackmore. You mentioned that collaboration is so important among botanic gardens, and that we accidentally compete. It seems like the sticking point often is around funding, that we're somewhat nervous about getting too close to going after the same funder. Can you speak to that aspect? Because at least in the United States, that's the principal impediment.
I think that if you look back into the instincts of each individual botanic garden, we've always had a strong focus on we must go out and win the resources we need to support ourselves. And I know in your job, Scott, as much as in mine, that that's a large part of what botanic garden directors do. But actually, I think what we're learning through experience when we work together is that the bigger successes follow through from partnership. So if you take something like the global strategy, for example, which came about because of a meeting of a couple of dozen botanic gardens deciding to do something together for a change, we then were able to influence international governmental policy through the CBD. Now, that in itself didn't unlock bigger resources, but my fundamental belief is that the things we can offer to do in partnership are on so much of a greater scale, more sized in proportion to the challenges that the planet has, that actually we can secure those levels of resources. So even though probably the day job is to try and fundraise for one's own botanic garden, the bigger job is working together and really winning the resources we need for our entire community of activities.
One more question.
Ah. No.
Nope.
Well, I'll repeat your question.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, Maite Delmas from the Natural History Museum in Paris. I was wondering what was happening this week regarding possible meetings of the two networks. Could you tell us a little more and say how we can contribute or help or...
It's a good question, and I think if I may be mistaken in this answer, but my belief is that there is no formal meeting between the two organisations during the course of the week. However, myself and other members of the Council of IABG are going to have a meeting, and I know that several, perhaps most of those council members share the concern that we don't want to end up being a competing organisation. But that we're not expecting to be able to resolve that as an outcome of this meeting, but the committees and boards of the two organisations will continue moving forward. And I think both are committed to the principle of merging and having a single voice. I think everybody understands that that's what we need. But when that meeting takes place, most people will actually be members of both organisations, evidently. So I intend to persuade myself that a single organisation is what we need. I almost convinced myself, but I think that we all feel that we must get to that state and have a satisfactory merger of the two organisations. So not formally, I don't expect that we'll be announcing that at the end of this Congress, but relatively soon afterwards, and follow up between the two councils and committees, I think that we should hopefully reach a happy conclusion.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Steve, thank you very much. And if you have any further questions, come up to afterwards.